Everyone has heard of Wyatt Earp and the shootout at the OK Corral, where Wyatt, his brothers Virgil and Morgan, and Doc Holliday fought it out with the Clantons and the McLaurys. It has gone down in history as the greatest gunfight ever, even though it only lasted less than a minute. Countless books have been written and many movies made about Wyatt Earp. But what do we really know about the person? He was known as the toughest, meanest, fastest-drawing marshal the West has known. But how did he become this legend? How did he get so tough? Where did he learn to handle a gun the way he did? What happened before the OK Corral? The Old West cannot be understood unless Wyatt Earp is also understood. His claim to fame is his controversial period in Tombstone, Arizona. And some say the fact that he died in 1929 at the ripe old age of 80 was another claim to fame, especially for a gunfighter. Most of them died by the gun. He was born in Illinois in 1848. His parents were Nicholas Porter Earp and Virginia Ann Cooksey Earp. He was over 6 feet tall, with dark blonde hair and blue eyes. Wyatt was a buffalo hunter, a horse thief, a fighter and gambler, and a ladies' man. He came across this country from Iowa to San Bernardino, California, with his family, fighting Indians all the while. He worked as a stagecoach driver at 17, going from San Bernardino to Los Angeles. He went to Kansas City with a good sum of money in his belt from working and gambling. Kansas City was the metropolitan playground for the frontiersmen who hankered for the finest and fanciest in entertainment, food, and drink, and the latest styles in weapons. Wyatt frequently commented about Sheriff Tom Spears from Kansas City. I was a fair hand with pistol, rifle, or shotgun, but I learned more about gunfighting from Tom Spears' cronies during the summer of '71 than I had dreamed was in the book. Bear River Tom Smith, whom I had known in Wyoming, where he was the hero of the Bear River Troubles, and who was one of the most courageous men who fought for law and order at the old frontier, had been Marshal of Abilene. Texas men from the cattle trail had been standing the town on end, and 2 of them had killed Tom. After a long hunt for an able citizen to take the marshal's place, Abilene sent for Bill. Hickok tamed the Texas men in short order, although he had to kill 2 or 3 in the process. Wyatt Earp's venture as a buffalo hunter undoubtedly gave first rise to legends which picture him as invariably playing a lone hand. He ignored established hunting practices and avoided the populous camps, whereupon other hunters ascribed to him an habitual aloofness which the man never possessed. Wyatt simply followed the independence of thought and action which repeatedly set him apart from his contemporaries, and by which, unquestionably, he won his ultimate rank on the frontier. Wyatt Earp was a man of action. He was born, reared, and lived in an environment which held words and theories of small account, in which sheer survival often was achieved through deeds alone. Wyatt Earp was a thinking man whose mental processes were as quick and direct and unflustered by circumstance and as effective as the actions they inspired. To the lover of swift and decisive action, Wyatt Earp's achievements surely must be of interest in themselves. His taming of Manon Clements and 50 cowboy killers in the streets of Wichita. His play against Clay Allison of the Washita in the plaza at Dodge City. The Battle of the OK Corral, or his sawed-off shotgun duel with Curly Bill. Through them, Wyatt Earp moved steadily, surely on, guided by the philosophy fitted to his surroundings, to which he gave fullest expression in admonishment of Ike Clanton, braggart, outlaw, cow thief, and murderer. Go on home, Ike, Wyatt suggested in the face of Clanton's threats to gun the marshal. You talk too much for a fighting man. When Wyatt Earp first met Bat Masterson at the Salt Fork, early in '72, Masterson was barely 16. And Bat had recorded that his admiration for Wyatt, which was to ripen into a lifelong friendship, had inception in Wyatt's kindness to an exceedingly homesick boy. As one result of their relationship, it is possible to recount fully certain incidents of the buffalo camps to which Wyatt Earp attached small importance. Masterson always insisted that before Wyatt left the Salt Fork in the spring of '72, he owned a frontier-wide reputation for fearlessness, which definitely shaped his career, in support of which Bat quoted others less prejudiced than he may have been. Wyatt was a shy young man with few intimates, Bat said that Billy Dixon recalled. With casual acquaintances, he seldom spoke unless spoken to. When he did say anything, it was to the point, without fear or favor, which wasn't relished by some, but that never bothered Wyatt. To those who knew him well, he was a genial companion. He had the most even disposition I ever saw. I never knew him to lose his temper. He was more intelligent, better educated, and far better mannered than the majority of his associates, which probably did not help them to understand him. His reserve limited his friendships, but more than one stranger down on his luck has had first-hand evidence of Wyatt's generosity. I think his outstanding quality was the nicety with which he gauged the efforts and the time for every move. That, plus his absolute confidence in himself, gave him the edge over the run of men. Another thing I remember is that Wyatt had the best horses at Salt Fork. An additional Earp characteristic which did not tend to increase Wyatt's general popularity was mentioned by both Dixon and Tillman. In all the years during which I was intimately associated with Wyatt as a buffalo hunter and a peace officer, Tillman said, I never knew him to take a drink of liquor. Tillman neither drank nor smoked. He never questioned another man's right to drink as he pleased, and I've been with him in more than one all-night session where whiskey was consumed as rapidly as drinks could be drawn from the barrel. But Wyatt did his tanking up on coffee. On spree days in the camps, with 200 or 300 fighting men three-quarter full of raw spirits and hunting trouble, only the rankest coward or a man of great courage could dodge difficulties of a serious nature through general recognition of his status. Old buffalo hunters unanimously agreed that Wyatt Earp was one of the few men whom the trouble seekers avoided, and that with the certain rare exceptions, he went about his business unmolested. Even thus early in his life, without a single gunfight in his record, Wyatt enjoyed the wholesome respect of the adventure-hardened men into whose company his calling took him. He was reputed to be speedier and surer with a pistol than was safe in an adversary. Several episodes at the camps had established the quality of his courage. Wyatt's reputation with firearms had been won at the target matches upon which the hunters bet large sums in cash or hides. Marksmanship of high degree was essential to success in these contests, and he had repeatedly demonstrated that with pistol or rifle, and shooting under any of the numerous conditions imposed to determine all-round proficiency, he had few equals. One or two affairs in which some hunters had decided to shoot out a difference of opinion with Wyatt Earp and had found himself looking into Wyatt's pistol barrel before he could get his own from the holster, had been enough to satisfy the most exacting as to his speed. In these instances, Wyatt would have been justified by the code of the camp in pressing his advantage to a fatal conclusion. That he did not do so, that he carried his gunplay but far enough to protect his own life and refused to take another's, struck most of the hunters as peculiar. So much so that it later was a subject of considerable comment. In other years, there were other men who could not fathom this magnanimity. Certain ones who owed their lives to its existence in the martial Wyatt Earp lived, perversely enough, to hate him bitterly for its gesture. Another accomplishment for which Wyatt had been remembered was his fortune as a gambler. Pat Masterson has said that Wyatt was the best poker player he ever saw in action, and that in bucking a Monte or a faro game, as well as banking one, he had few equals in nerve to back his judgment, a prime factor in success of those pastimes. It was further held, and not without a reason, that any game in which Wyatt Earp participated would be played on the square, that he possessed both the astuteness and the courage to keep it so. Among camp followers who preyed upon prodigal buffalo hunters were hundreds of crooked gamblers, on the range ostensibly after hides, but in reality to fleece unwary card players. Stakes ran high. Protracted games might see thousands of dollars change hands, and daring operators might take heavy winnings. The crooks worked in pairs or trios and trimmed their victims methodically. They recruited their number from reputed man-killers, and to them, skill with guns was of even greater importance than the card dexterity. 2 or 3 of these sure-thing artists in the same game would build up interest in the play until it suited them to introduce their trickery. From that point on, their answers to any charges were made with pistols. A hunter who objected to play which he thought questionable might be shot out of his seat for his protest. The best he could expect was enforced retirement. To certain old-timers, the most notable recollection of Wyatt Earp in the buffalo camps dealt with a salt pork poker game for high stakes, in which 2 players were notorious gunmen suspected of a partnership in crooked gambling, and by which Wyatt stood as a spectator. After the tide of fortune had definitely set in that direction of the 2 suspected men, Wyatt left the circle of onlookers for a time. He returned wearing his pistols. It may be well to record here another peculiarity of habit which distinguished Wyatt from his associates. Unless hunting, he seldom went armed. His camp was a half-mile from his nearest neighbors, and on visits to friends in the larger groups, it was unusual for him to wear guns. Thus, their presence at his hips upon his return to the poker game attracted the attention of those who knew him. When a player quit, Wyatt sat into the game. He shifted his pistols to handy position, placed a roll of greenbacks on the blanket before him, and observed quietly. If no one objects, we'll play honest poker. No one objected audibly, and the game continued. Eventually, with one of the sharpers dealing, came the play which Wyatt Earp had anticipated. From the betting, it was apparent that every player had been dealt a strong hand, and the pot was swelling until nearly all the money in sight was at the center of the blanket. The men under suspicion forced the play before the draw until Wyatt asked the one with the largest sum in front of him how much was in the pile. In a table stake game, the man had to answer. "All right," Wyatt said, "I'll tap you," as he counted out an equal amount. This left the gunman with the choice of risking all his money on the hand or resigning his interest in the pot. And every other player in the game must stake a like amount or as much as he had left toward it on the outcome of the draw. To those who did not fathom his purpose, it appeared that Wyatt was turning the play to suit a crooked gambler. With all bets down, cards were drawn. Then Wyatt interrupted proceedings. With his cards in his left hand, his right resting on the blanket in front of him, he addressed the dealer and his accomplice by name. "Throw down your cards and get out," he ordered. "I guess you didn't hear me when I said we'd play honest poker." In that time and place, the accusation of cheating at cards meant gunplay, and men who made a business of gambling went prepared for it. The two against whom Wyatt had called the turn were no exceptions. Each wore 2 pistols. The inference needed no explanation, yet Wyatt had made no move for his weapons. He was looking steadily across the blanket at his adversaries. "Throw down your cards," he repeated. "And don't reach for anything else." Wyatt's left hand held his cards. His right was still empty. This was an unadulterated nerve. As if at some prearranged signal, and simultaneously, both crooks went after their weapons. Before either had a gun half drawn from the holster, they were looking into the muzzle of a 6-shooter in Wyatt Earp's right hand. Bat Masterson, who saw the play, said that Wyatt's move was faster than his eye could follow. "Put him back," Wyatt cautioned, "and get out of here." To witnesses of the episode, there was something inexplicable about the whole business. They could not understand why the card sharps had withheld immediate gunplay. It should have followed Wyatt's first challenge instantaneously. Because of their unwanted hesitancy, the two gamblers could do nothing and live, but get out of the camp, leaving behind all the money that they had staked in the poker game. The young man who had driven them away did not trouble to disarm them, and apparently paid no attention to them after they left the circle of players. At this, the spectators also wondered. Why, when the killers went for their guns, and Wyatt beat them in the draw, hadn't he exercised the established prerogative and shot both of them, as he could have done easily? In after years, Wyatt answered this latter question. "Why should I have killed that pair?" he said. "I protected my money against their attempt to cheat me out of it. And I showed them up for a couple of cowards whose bluff caved in quickly enough once the break wasn't all on their side. That was all the occasion called for." Some hours after the gunman left, the poker game ended with Wyatt Earp, as he remembered well, a loser as far as the cash was concerned. But he had called the turn on a pair of professional killers in a manner that was to spread fame of his courage from the Rio Grande to Great Slave Lake. It was the forerunner of a series of similar displays of fearlessness, which are still a source of apparently endless speculation. On at least 2 occasions, as Bat Masterson has further testified, Wyatt found it necessary to establish his prowess in the knockdown and drag-out, rough-and-tumble, physical encounters in which he was forced by men who had openly boasted that they would take his measure. In frontier parlance, such a phrase were simply fights, to distinguish them from battles in which guns or knives were employed. Fights for all the term implied, for in them anything went, including hitting, wrestling, kicking, gouging, and biting. The fight was a continuous affair from start to finish, usually until one combatant was dead or unconscious. More than one prominent citizen of the West has lived out his life after such an encounter with but the fragment of an ear on one side of his head, and that fragment showing plainly the teeth marks of a man who chewed off the rest of the organ. In each of 2 instances which Bat Masterson recalled, a professional bully who had fought his way to championship reputation in the Buffalo camp challenged Wyatt Earp in such fashion that there was no dodging the issue. Whereupon Wyatt proceeded about the defense of his person as coolly and as efficiently as he seemed to have done everything else. Wyatt had exceptional strength and was marvelously fast with his hands and feet. Also, he was a skillful boxer, a rarity among frontier fighters, and he knew as many tricks of wrestling as the next. With the fact established that he avoided trouble because he disliked it, and not because he feared the outcome of the battle, Wyatt Earp's inclinations were apt to be respected. And thereafter in the buffalo camps, he experienced no difficulty in regulating his own conduct. A score of exploits similar to his affrays with the gamblers and the professional bullies were credited to Wyatt during his buffalo hunting days. By the time he became a peace officer, he was celebrated through the West because of them. The feature of each legendary yarn is that Wyatt allowed some killer who had forced a gunplay upon him to go unharmed after he had beaten the killer to the draw. And for that reason, not to mention numerous others, it is probable that the fabrication was built upon the one episode of the poker game. In further consideration of the spread of Wyatt Earp's legends, which dealt with his gun-throwing proficiency, it is pertinent to remember that the buffalo camps of the 70s were the training schools which turned loose on the frontier the most talented gunfighters and gunmen of any time in the territory. From them, there traveled over the West to the cow towns and the mining camps a great majority of outlaw killers. The gunmen who made frontier life a hazardous affair for peaceably inclined citizens, long after dangers inherent to the country itself had been overcome. From them, too, came frontier marshals and sheriffs who blazed the trail for law and order with six-shooters and sawed-off shotguns. To graduate from this school at the head of the class with all honors conferred by fellow students who were also the faculty, and that without having fired a shot to solve any problems of life or death, was indeed a distinction. So unique that of itself, perhaps it demanded legendary justification. It's evident from reminiscences of those who completed the colorful course of draw and shoot instruction that if Wyatt Earp's gun-toting alma mater had known of the phrase, she would have certified him to his profession, summa cum laude. In April 1872, Wyatt went into Caldwell. The following September found him back on the buffalo range, but forced to ride much further west to find profitable hunting. The winter of 1872-73 brought 10,000 additional buffalo hunters, and the herds suffered proportionately. The Santa Fe Railroad had pushed the end of steel into Dodge City. And from that single, newly born community of 2 stores, 5 saloons, and 2 dance halls, 400,000 buffalo hides were shipped before the season closed. By hunting the less frequented areas, Wyatt and his skinner managed to approximate their kill of the preceding year. But they foresaw the rapidly approaching end to large profits for the many in wholesale buffalo slaughter. Already the character of the Kansas prairie settlements was changing. As on the range, the buffalo gave way to beef cattle. The tide of the great Texas trail herds was mounting, speeding buffalo extinction and supplanting overnight the business built up by the hunters as trading posts, which had existed solely for their patronage, competed for prestige as cow towns. In April of 1873, just after he had turned 25, Wyatt settled accounts with the hide buyers and started on a tour of the newly created cattle shipping centers. He had several $1,000s in his possession, and in his mind was the possibility that his stake might provide an opening wedge in the cow business, at which he heard so many were building fortunes. In the red decade of frontier history, the Kansas cow towns Abilene, Newton, Caldwell, Ellsworth, Honeywell, Hayes, Wichita, and Dodge were born, boomed, and broken as terminals of the Texas Trail. One was like another in their heyday of untrammeled iniquity, blatantly lawless, uproariously sinful, and boastfully bad. Too wild to be curried, too tough to be tamed, the local braggarts yelled. During the Civil War, the United States government had herded some 3,000 Wichita, Caddo, Waco, and Andarka Indians into a camp on the Kansas Prairie near the junction of Cowskin Creek and the Arkansas River. After the war, the government decided to move them into Indian territory, and in 1867 contracted with Jesse Chisholm, a Cherokee half-breed, to open a trail and establish supply camps along the route the Indians were to follow. Chisholm loaded his bull teams and rounded up a herd of 100 Indian ponies, which wranglers drove ahead of the wagon train. Quicksand was an ever-present menace in fording the treacherous Salt Fork of the Arkansas and the North and South Canadian rivers and their tributaries. Chisholm used his pony herd to settle these sands, driving the animals full tilt back and forth across the fords until the footing was packed solid, after which the teams could cross. Indians, soldiers, and livestock by the thousands followed the ruts of the Chisholm bull wains into the nations. Texas cattle herds driven north immediately after the Civil War had followed the Army route from Austin towards Sedalia, Missouri, turning off at the mouth of the Grand River to strike for the railroad. In 1871, cattlemen had generally abandoned this trace for the shorter Chisholm Trail. And to handle the booming beef business, a score of shipping centers sprang into existence at points where they met the railroads. Wichita was among the first Kansas villages to bid actively for the cattle trade. But failure of the railroads to build into that camp on schedule took the early drives past the site of the Indian encampments. By 1873, the Chisholm Trail was a roadway several hundred yards wide, hoof-packed to concrete solidity, stretching across the wilderness from Red River Crossing to the Smoky Hill near Abilene. Wyatt Earp's most vivid recollection of the early Kansas cow camps was that in them all money was evident in far greater quantities than the frontier had ever known, and that opportunities for spreading it had been provided at every hand. Furthermore, with the exception of an occasional eating house and a few general merchandise establishments, every last one of these opportunities was to be included in the category which a softer civilization referred to as vice. Abilene, with a handful of actual residents, had 20 saloons and gambling houses to one block of street, and a dance hall for every 2 saloons, in ratio of 10 to 1 over all other types of business houses in the camp. 2,500 cowboys thronged these centers of attraction in a single night, each with a year's wages to spend. Bosses and herd owners had thousands of dollars to throw away. Whiskey was delivered to the cow camp in carload lots. Monte, Keno, poker, and faro games, as well as the frontier bordellos, honky-tonks, or hurdy-gurdies as they were called, ran full blast 24 hours a day. Every man in town wore at least one, more often 2, 6-shooters on his belt. Fights were hourly incidents. The galaxy of shooting stars which reddened the cowtown's firmament in the 1870s included Ben and Billy Thompson, Jip, Joe, Jim, and Manon Clemens, Clay Allison, John Wesley Hardin, Smoky Hill Thompson, Ed King, the Catfish Kid, Curly Bill Brocius, Cal Polk, John Ringo, Bill Moore, to pick offhand but a few of the scores who won 6-gun immortality. Gunfighter or gunman? It was thus the Old West phrase distinction between good men and evil. He who held his own against such competition shot ahead of fast company. In any attempt to gauge the accomplishments of those frontier peace officers who dominated the cow camps of the 70s, first consideration must be given to the single law of the old gunfighter's code, unbreakable to the man who would hold his own respect or that of friends and enemies. Assassinations were not uncommon in the western settlements, but they were the resort of gunmen held beneath contempt, even by the most notorious outlaws. A top-notch gunfighter of Wyatt Earp's day did no shooting from cover and fired at no man's back. The object of his attentions must get what the West called an even break. Least of all might the majesty of the law stoop to ignominious play. It was axiomatic with Western peace officers to whom distinction was accorded that no malefactors, no matter what his crime, was to be shot down without his chance to surrender or make his fight. Throw him up was the warning to a potential prisoner. Then a pause for that fraction of a second in which the challenged one decided which way to move his hand. If he moved his hand skyward, he was disarmed and led to the nearest calaboose. If he chose to reach for his belt or his armpits, he usually was carried to Boot Hill. In the lore of bustling cities and humdrum villages from whose terminology Boot Hill has long since vanished, in the saga of the Old West, the figure of Wyatt Earp, as the Kansas cowtowns knew him, appears as the legendary type specimen of the old-time gunfighting marshal. The validity of his eminence is attested by 100 contemporaries who insisted that in combat, Wyatt Earp had no equal on the frontier. Whether an encounter hung upon mere physical prowess or pure courage, plus deadly skill with a Colt 45, a Winchester, or a sawed-off shotgun, to this consensus, Bat Masterson contributed. In the 1870s, Bat wrote, that immense territory stretching from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean and from the Brazos River in Texas to the Red Cloud Agency in Dakota knew no braver man than Wyatt Earp. He was the one man I personally knew whom I regarded as absolutely destitute of fear. When everything was said and done, he valued his opinion of himself far more than the opinion of others. It was his own good report that he sought to preserve. No man ever saw Wyatt Earp display the white feather. On one occasion, when Wyatt Earp was recalling some incidents of a visit to Abilene, a young person observed somewhat disdainfully that in all of his stories of the cow camps of all the people he mentioned were invariably going in or coming out of a gambling house, a dance hall, or a saloon. Wyatt was his laconic self as he replied, "We had no YMCAs." In the summer of '73, Wyatt Earp roamed from one cow camp to another on the Kansas plains. At Abilene, he heard that leaders of the beef industry had transferred headquarters to Ellsworth, a village some 65 miles west. Ellsworth was advertising herself as the coming town of the frontier, with what justification may be gleaned from the columns of a weekly journal in a rival camp which printed under the headings, State News. As we go to press, hell is still in session at Ellsworth. Wyatt's visit to the booming cow camp was perhaps the most far-reaching move of his career. No more typical trail-driving rendezvous existed on the plains than Ellsworth, Kansas in August 1873. More important cattle shipping centers developed as the Texas trail herds grew. But geographically, architecturally, and culturally, the settlement of 300 residents was all that the woolliest cowtown of the Wild West ever was reputed to be. Day and night, the sweltering plaza was lined on either side by unbroken rows of cow ponies tethered to the hitching rails. Horse corrals overflowed. Flimsy hotels slept 6 and 8 cattlemen to the room. Along the plank walks or sun-baked dirt paths from saloon to gambling house to dance halls to the stores and back to the saloons again roamed hundreds of Texas men in sombreros, chaps, and high-heeled boots, cartridge belts and six-guns, picturesque swashbucklers hunting excitement. If, with the herds at her gates and the cattle drivers within, Ellsworth needed one touch to establish beyond the carping of Wichita, Hayes, and Abilene her supremacy as the cowboy capital of the West, She got it when Ben Thompson and his brother Bill reached her Grand Central Hotel. Wyatt Earp had encountered the Thompsons before in a casual way. He knew them, their reputations, and their history. Both Thompsons were remarkably courageous men. Bill was the quicker to start an argument, possibly, but Ben could be counted on to finish any quarrel which either of them opened. As Bill was particularly pugnacious when drinking and always had some liquor in him, he kept his brother's love of finished fights reasonably well satiated. According to Bat Masterson, Ben Thompson was the most dangerous killer in the Old West. In his story of the outlaw, Emerson Huff substantiates this estimate. Huff called Ben Thompson a very perfect exemplar of the creed of the six-shooter. With the six-shooter, Huff continued, he, Thompson, was a peerless shot, an absolute genius, none in all his wide surrounding claiming to be his superior. And he had a ferocity of disposition which grew with years, until he had, as one of his friends put it, a craving to kill people. Wyatt Earp quickly learned that Ben Thompson in local parlance had Ellsworth treed. Early in the season, when it became evident that the village was to be the recreational rendezvous for some 2,000 cowboys who preferred their pleasures raw and red, the Ellsworth councilman had made precautionary moves by hiring J.W. Brocky Jack Norton, a famous gunfighter, as marshal, and appointing as first deputy John Happy Jack Morco, with a record as an Indian fighter and authentic credit for a dozen six-gun killings against white men. Two additional deputies, Charlie Brown and Ed Crawford, also were gunfighters of repute. Throughout May, June, and July, the editor of the Ellsworth Reporter, the cow camp's weekly newspaper, gave the mayor his moral support by printing each Thursday the head of his local column, "All is quiet in Ellsworth." Ben Thompson was the leading spirit of the lawless. His right-hand man was Brother Bill. As left Bauer, Ben and George Pesher, another Texas killer, and as additional backing, an army of cowpunchers who could be counted upon to the limit in any gunplay against northern men. For 2 months of the summer of '73, Ben Thompson, from headquarters at the Grand Central, where he had opened his faro bank, defied the vaunted Ellsworth marshals with impunity, and the hundreds of cowboys in town did likewise. Citizenry, mayor, councilman, and imported peace officers had been treed together and apparently did not intend to come down until the last Texas man had started south. Such was the status of Ellsworth's hope for law and order when Wyatt Earp reached the camp. From the experienced cattleman, Wyatt soon learned that the cow business had been too thoroughly upset by the money panic and bad range conditions to make his proposed investment advisable. So he decided to hunt buffalo another season. Meanwhile, he witnessed numerous gunfights in the streets and saloons and noted with some amusement the manner in which the Ellsworth constabulary took cover before the Texas men. Early in the afternoon of August 18, 1873, Wyatt had the sun-scorched plaza almost to himself as he lounged beneath the wooden awnings which shaded Beebe's General Store and Brennan's Saloon next door. In a saloon beyond Brennan's, Wyatt knew an open poker game was in progress, with stakes of unusual size. Play was so high that the Thompsons had left the faro bank to sit in. When informed of a table rule against guns, Ben and Bill had still been sufficiently intrigued by the size of the pots to send their weapons back to the Grand Central, and they drew cards. Wyatt had heard that the Thompsons were forcing the play, that Bill was drinking steadily and getting mean, whereupon he was well satisfied to be out of the game. Wyatt had small fancy for the Thompsons in any case, less for Bill at a poker table with high stakes and drunk. From the saloon in which the Thompsons were gambling, a violent uproar was followed by the appearance of the brothers on the plaza. They came out of the door on the run, Bill cursing loudly and shouting threats over his shoulder as the pair made for the Grand Central. A moment later, they reappeared from the hotel and headed back towards the saloon. Ben carrying a double-barrel shotgun and Bill a rifle. At the rail in front of the saloon stood a pair of horses hitched to a hay wagon. And behind this rack, the Thompsons took their stand. Bill shouting threats and imprecations, and Ben adding profanely insulting invitations to those inside the saloon to come on out and make your fight. Sheriff Whitney was in his shirt sleeves and palpably unarmed. Yet without further hesitation, he walked over to the hay wagon where the Thompsons stood with cocked weapons, waiting for someone to come out of the saloon. "You keep out of this, Sheriff," Ben warned him. "We don't want to hurt you." "Don't be foolish, Ben," Whitney replied. Thompson's rejoinder was a torrent of profanity directed at Sterling and his friends, whereupon the sheriff went into the saloon. He returned to the walk with the word that Sterling had been forcibly prevented from coming out to fight and had been taken by friends to his camp outside the town by way of the back door. Whitney feared that Sterling might be shot on sight by one of the Thompsons when he again came into Ellsworth, and to smooth over the quarrel, invited the Thompsons into Brennan's saloon for a drink and a talk. Cowpunchers and merchants went indoors, and as Wyatt moved back to his lounging place between Brennan's doorway and Beebe's entrance, he again had the plaza to himself. 15 minutes later, Whitney came out of the saloon alone and stopped to talk. "They've calmed down a bit," the sheriff reported. "They're inside with a bunch of Texas men." "Did you take their guns away from them?" Wyatt asked. "Well, no," Whitney replied. "They wouldn't stand for that." Before Wyatt had time to comment on this matter, Bill Thompson appeared in Brennan's doorway with Ben's shotgun. "I'll get a sheriff if I don't get anybody else," he declared. Wyatt and Whitney turned to face him. Bill fired both barrels of the gun point blank into the sheriff's breast and ran back into the saloon. Wyatt caught Whitney in his arms. "I'm done," the sheriff gasped. "Get me home." Friends of Sheriff Whitney volunteered to take the dying man home. Wyatt Earp turned his attention to the Thompsons. He stepped again into Beebe's entrance and peered around the door casing into the plaza for sight of the Ellsworth peace officers. None was in view. Beebe's door opened, and there at Wyatt's shoulder was Happy Jack Marco, Indian fighter and six-gun expert, 2 belts of ammunition around his waist, and a .45 Colts at either hip. Wyatt gave way to let Marco reconnoiter. "For God's sake, get out of town," Ben Thompson urged Bill. "You shot Sheriff Whitney." "I know it," Bill replied. "I'd have shot him if he'd been Jesus Christ." In groups around the plaza, 300 or 400 more Texans were distributed. Every man Jack had 6 guns at his hips and a gun hand itching for a play. As Ben Thompson halted his tirade momentarily, Cad Pierce sought the limelight. "I'll give $1,000 to anybody who'll knock off another marshal," he shouted. As the cowboys yelled appreciation of this offer, Deputy Marshal Brown appeared at the far end of the railroad building. 145 slugs screeched across the plaza, and Brown took cover. After urging Happy Jack to jump out and kill the Thompsons, Wyatt had kept silent. But the mayor's pleas to the marshals and contempt for their discretion, abetted by reaction to the cold-blooded fashion in which Sheriff Whitney had been shot down, moved him to comment. "Nice police force you've got," Wyatt said to Miller. "Who are you?" the mayor demanded. "Just a looker-on," Wyatt replied. "Well, don't talk so much," Miller snapped. "You haven't even got a gun." As Wyatt was in shirt sleeves, it was evident that he was unarmed. He seldom carried weapons in the settlements, and those he owned were in his hotel room. Well, it's none of my business, Wyatt admitted. But if it was, I'd get me a gun and arrest Ben Thompson or kill him. Brocky Jack aired. Don't pay any attention to that kid, Jim, he interrupted. Mayor Miller was desperate. You're fired, Norton, he said. You too, Marco. The mayor snatched the marshal's badge from Brocky Jack's shirt front. As soon as I can find Brown and Crawford, I'll fire them. He turned to Wyatt Earp. I'll make this your business. You're Marshal of Ellsworth. Here's your badge. Go into Beebe's and get some guns. I order you to arrest Ben Thompson. To the best of Wyatt Earp's recollection, he voiced no formal acceptance of his impromptu appointment as Ellsworth's peace officer. He turned and walked to Beebe's firearms counter and asked for a pair of second-hand .45s with holsters and cartridge belts. Wyatt Earp's short journey across the Ellsworth Plaza under the muzzle of Ben Thompson's shotgun established for all time his preeminence among gunfighters of the West. But the episode has been ignored in written tales. Old-timers have said that Wyatt Earp looked like a boy as he crossed the plaza. 6 feet tall, weighing not more than 155 pounds, he too was the owner of good blue eyes. But in contrast to Thompson's red and puffy countenance, Wyatt's lean and muscular features were smooth-shaven and tan brown. His slimness further set off by white shirt, black trousers, wide-brimmed black hat, and high-heeled horseman's boots. As he walked, his hands swung easily, conveniently close to his holsters, but making no overt moves. As Wyatt reached a point possibly 50 yards from Thompson, Cad Pierce said something to which Ben snarled over his shoulder in reply. Pierce subsided, and with the other Texas men, waited for Ben to call the turn. Wyatt Earp had a definite course of action in mind as he advanced toward the 100 or more half-drunken cowboys, any and all of whom were keyed to cutting loose at him with twice as many guns for the mere satisfaction of seeing him die. He knew that to half the men in the crowd he was an utter stranger. The rest might know him by sight or name. He had no fear-inspiring record as a killer. So far as anyone in Ellsworth might know, he had never used guns against a human adversary in all his life. He realized, too, that he was a target few men in the 100 could miss at 50 yards. That he was heeled with a pair of guns was evident to all. One false or hesitant gesture with either hand, and he was fair game for the first to draw. I knew what I would do before the mayor pinned Brocky Jack's badge on my shirt, Wyatt said in recalling the affair. I based my actions on my knowledge of Ben Thompson's vanity and of the Texas men in the crowd. When Wyatt Earp was about 40 yards distant, Ben Thompson called him. "What do you want, Wyatt?" he shouted. "I want you, Ben," Wyatt replied, walking steadily forward. Neither Ben Thompson nor any onlooker, and at least of all Wyatt Earp, had offered a completely satisfactory explanation for what followed. Thompson made no move with his gun and did not speak again until Wyatt was less than 30 yards away. "I'd rather talk than fight," the killer called. "I'll get you either way, Ben," Wyatt assured him without halting in his stride. "Wait a minute," said Thompson. "What do you want me to do?" "Throw your shotgun into the road and put up your hands, and tell your friends to stay out of this play," Wyatt answered. Less than 15 yards now separated the men. "Will you stop and let me talk to you?" Ben asked. Wyatt halted. He knew now positively that he could take Thompson alive or dead, whichever way the gunman chose to turn events. He had Ben talking, which is the gravest error possible to a gun thrower who has serious business at hand. "What are you going to do with me?" Thompson asked. Kill you or take you to jail, Wyatt informed him. Brown's over there by the depot with the rifle, Ben objected. The minute I give up my guns, he'll cut loose on me. If he does, Wyatt promised, I'll give you back your guns and we'll shoot it out with him. As long as you're my prisoner, the man that gets you will have to get me. Thompson hesitated. Come on, Wyatt ordered. Throw down your gun or make your fight. Ben Thompson grinned. You win, he said, tossed his shotgun on the road and shoved both hands over his head. Wyatt Earp's guns were still in their holsters. Now, for the first time, his hand went to his right hip. You fellas get back, he ordered the Texas men. Move. As they obeyed, Wyatt stepped up to Thompson and unbuckled his prisoner's gun belt. Come on, Ben, he said. We'll go over to the calaboose. With the famous Thompson 6 guns dangling from their belts in his left hand, Wyatt marched his prisoner across the plaza to Judge V.B. Osborne's court. There was talk of lynching, but Wyatt anticipated no serious trouble on that score. Real danger would come with any attempt of the Texas men to rescue Ben from the law. The Thompson element dictated his next move. Peshore, Pierce, Kane, and Good shouldered into the front ranks, each with his .45s belted to his waist, and Pierce carrying the shotgun with which Whitney had been assassinated and which Ben had thrown into the road. Wyatt spoke to Hogue in an undertone, then turned on the gunman. Get out of here, he ordered. Pierce, take your crowd outside and keep them there. There'll be no lynching and no rescue. Pierce looked at Thompson. Better go, Cad, Ben suggested. He means what he says. With the courtroom cleared, Thompson's arraignment proceeded. What's the charge? Asked Judge Osborne. As no one else volunteered to reply, Wyatt suggested that Ben was probably an accessory to murder. The judge turned to Mayor Miller as the proper person to indicate the enormity of Thompson's offense. The mayor hesitated, possibly in embarrassment under the keen blue eye of his hastily selected peace officer. Considered the economic importance of the Texas men to the community, then offered as an amendment his opinion that maybe Ben had disturbed the peace. Guilty, said the judge. $25 fine. Thompson grinned as he peeled the assessment from a roll of greenbacks. Do I get my guns? He inquired. Certainly, said the judge. You paid your fine and the marshal will restore any property he may have taken from you. As Thompson reached for his gun belts, Wyatt issued his last order as an Ellsworth peace officer. Ben, he said, court or no court, don't put those on here. You carry them straight to the Grand Central, and don't so much as hesitate on the way. I'll be watching you. Keep moving until you're out of my sight. After that, what you do will be none of my business. Wyatt stood in the courtroom door with his eye on Thompson until the gunman reached his hotel, then turned to Mayor Miller. Here, he said, is your badge. And here are the guns I got at Beebe's. I don't need them any longer. Don't you want to be Marshal of Ellsworth? Miller asked. I do not, replied Wyatt. We'll pay you $125 a month, the mayor offered. Ellsworth, Wyatt answered sententiously. Figures sheriff's at $25 a head. I don't figure the town's my size. Some years after this Ellsworth episode, Bat Masterson asked Ben Thompson why he had so docilely submitted to arrest by Wyatt Earp. Thompson's reply is quoted for what it may be worth. It was just a hunch, Ben told Bat. A hunch that Wyatt would get me if I opened up. I wasn't afraid of him, but I did want to die just then. And I had a hunch I was slated to if Wyatt went after his guns. But that wasn't all. It took nerve to come after me the way he did. He was just a youngster. but I could tell he'd go through with his play. He wouldn't have stood a chance to live against my crowd, even if he'd knocked me off. I didn't want to see a young fellow as game as Wyatt go out with no chance for an even break. Cad Pierce wanted me to cut loose when Wyatt was about halfway across the plaza. I didn't, and I never regretted it. If I had, I wouldn't be here telling about it either. The Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, arrived in Tombstone, in Arizona in 1879. Doc Holliday arrived in 1880. On October 26, 1881, the famous fight at the OK Corral took place. Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers were on one side, and the rustlers, their enemies, the McLaury brothers, the Clanton brothers, and William Claiborne, were on the other side. The Clantons, McLaurys, and Claibornes were getting set to leave town. Their horses were at the OK Corral. Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers were walking down to fight it out. The Earps and Doc were all dressed in black with white shirts and string ties. Sheriff Behan was in a barber shop when word reached him that trouble was impending. He ran out and found Marshal Virgil Earp on Hafford's corner. Behan urged the marshals not to push the issue. Virgil's answer was, "They're looking for a fight, and they can get it." He carried a shotgun, the muzzle touching the door sill. Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday were standing at 4th and Allen Streets. The sheriff hurried down to disarm the cowboys. If he could do so and take them prisoners, there would be no immediate trouble. The rustlers came out of the OK Corral, 2 of them leading their horses. Behan asked Frank McLaury for his gun. McLaury said they were leaving town and objected to giving up his weapon unless the Earps also did so. Ike Clanton and Tom McLaury said they weren't armed. Behan knew now that he had only minutes left in which to arrange an armistice. The Earp party could be seen coming down the sidewalk on the south side of Fremont Street below the post office. The sheriff moved quickly toward them and met them near Bauer's butcher shop. He tried to stop the Earp party, explaining that the gang was leaving town. There were 4 in the Earp party: Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday. They pushed past the sheriff toward the corral. Marshal Virgil Earp spoke harshly. "You're under arrest. Throw up your hands." 3 of the rustlers did so. The 4th, Tom McLaury, threw open his coat and said that he was unarmed. The 2 parties were now standing within 6 feet of each other. Almost instantly, 2 shots rang out, so close together they could not have been fired by the same person. Doc Holliday, carrying a nickel-plated pistol, got his action first. And Morgan Earp next, according to the testimony of witnesses. All hell broke loose. The cowboys made a game fight. Tom McLaury clung to the horn of his saddle to keep from falling, while he tried to unstrap a rifle fastened there. Frank McLaury and Bill Clanton answered the fire, turned on them. Both were already wounded to death and knew it, but they fought as long as they had strength to lift their 6-shooters. Billy Clanton, a boy of 19, was the last to go down. He stood against the adobe wall of an assayer's office and kept shooting as his body slowly slid along the wall to the ground. The battle lasted scarcely 30 seconds. When the guns no longer sounded, both McClorys were dead or dying. Billy Clanton was so badly riddled that he lived scarcely an hour. Morgan Earp was slightly wounded. Ike Clanton had escaped by way of Fly's photography gallery. They say that Wyatt let him go, seeing that he was unarmed. Wyatt Earp was the best of the Earps, an old-timer said. He was certainly the most remarkable, and there's no evidence that he ever took pleasure in killing. After a long hearing, the justice dismissed the case, alleging self-defense. The editor of the Nugget had the courage to come out in an editorial with the statement that the sentiment of the community was that justice had not been done. Some weeks later, Virgil Earp was shot and wounded by someone unknown. He recovered. The rustlers were not yet through. Nearly 5 months after the affair at the OK Corral, Morgan Earp was killed in Bob Hatch's saloon, the Bank Exchange. He was playing billiards at the time. A bullet fired from outside had crashed through the window to reach him. It was discovered that someone had piled up 2 boxes and stood on them in order to see his victim. Spence and Stillwell, the stage robbers arrested by Breckenridge, were known to be in town. They were out on bond awaiting trial. Spence proved an alibi as to the killing. Stillwell vanished from sight at once, riding hard for Tucson. 2 Indian wood choppers with him also disappeared. The Earps started with Morgan's body for California. With them went Doc Holliday, Sherman McMasters, and a man named Johnson. 2 men saw the train draw into the station. One was Ike Clanton and the other was Frank Stillwell. Said Ike warily, "They're aboard, we'd better light out." He did, but Stillwell lingered. It is believed he was hoping for a shot at some of his enemies. No chance offered. He turned and walked down the track, unaware that he had been seen. When Stillwell's body was found later, an examination showed that 4 rifle bullets and 2 loads of buckshot had been pumped into it. The Earp party returned to Tombstone. Sheriff Behan, standing in front of the Cosmopolitan Hotel, saw them come up. All of them were heavily armed. "Wyatt, I want to see you," Behan said. "You'll see me once too often," Wyatt answered darkly. Nonetheless, Wyatt knew that it was time to be gone. There were 50 cowboys in the hills ready to avenge the death of their friends. To walk the streets of Tombstone was dangerous. Grimly, the Earps and their friends rode out of town. But first, they had business afoot. At Pete Spence's camp, they stopped to collect the breed, suspected of killing Morgan. They found him chopping wood. His body was found a few hours later. The Earps and Doc Holliday went to Denver, where Wyatt's friend Bat Masterson protected his Tombstone immigrants. Eventually, the Earps went their several ways, most of them to California. Doc Holliday died a few years later of consumption in Colorado. Wyatt married Josephine, Josie, Sarah Marcus, who was a common-law wife of John Behan's. On January 12, 1929, Wyatt died in a small rented cottage in Los Angeles. He was 80 years of age. This is Wyatt Earp's last photograph, taken just a few weeks before his death. The greatest gunfighting marshal in the West was finally laid to rest. And folks have been talking about the legend of Wyatt Earp ever since.